welcome to Beyond Politics. I'm Catherine Clark. Ontario Conservative MP Chris Alexander had a distinguished career in the Foreign Service. He served as ambassador to Afghanistan, a stint that he began when he was only 34 years of age. Chris and his wife Hedvig decided to return to Canada after the birth of their first child. And it was at that point that Chris decided to throw his hat into the political ring. He ran in the last federal election, and he won. And Chris Alexander joins me now to talk all about a very interesting life beyond politics. Chris Alexander, welcome to Beyond Politics. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Great to be with you, Catherine.
I suppose we should do the full disclosure thing and say that we have known each other, but not particularly well. It's our parents who have known each other for basically their entire lives.
Exactly. And I've heard about you, even when I was far away.
And you were far away. I mean, you were really far away, and you chose to be far away because you joined at a fairly young age the Foreign Service. Mm-hmm. And we'll get more to that later. But I wanted to talk about the beginnings of Chris Alexander, and you're an only child. I'm an only child as well.
Yes.
And I wondered, I had a very positive experience being an only child. I really enjoyed it. And I wondered how you felt it influenced you as a kid growing up.
I feel very much the same way. It is different. You're in the minority in our society, in our generation. Most people have brothers and sisters. But I always felt in the neighborhoods I lived in and in the broader family I had, I was really close to friends mm-hmm. and cousins.
Right.
So it never felt isolated,
right.
as I think some only children do.
Yeah.
But in the best case scenario, it's you have that stability at home, but then a whole bunch of connections that are just not brothers and sisters, but equally intimate.
Yeah. Your mom and dad are really wonderful people. Your dad is a lot like you in terms of being really outgoing, very generous with his time and with his attitude towards other people. Your mom is very involved in the community. She's also a lovely person. What kind of an influence did they have on you as a person?
Well, they are very social people.
Yeah.
In their bigger families, and they each have several brothers and sisters, and in their communities. So you're right, they're activists in a sense and conveners of other people, and I think that did influence me, but it also brought me into contact with a lot of people from different walks of life, and actually, I think not by accident, a lot of politicians
right.
Early in life. And it's interesting, I remember politicians and discussions about politics from my earliest stages of growing up, because your father was sometimes around the house. My father and he had been at university together. Your mother, always strong views on the issues of the day, and compelling views. And then others, from our Toronto environment, whether it was Barbara McDougall or Ron Atke. And so I understood the importance of that profession mm-hmm. And that calling to our society. And I think my parents were attracted to that. I think they each, my mother's father had been the mayor of Huntsville, so a long time ago, an elected politician. And my father certainly thought about becoming, running for office in the early 70s, when, not long after yours would have started his parliamentary career.
He would have been a great politician, your dad.
Well, and
in that true sense of a person who just wants to do the best for their community and make the country a better place.
I think he would have been great, but I'm sort of humbled by what actually happened, because he decided not to do it in order to spend more time with his family.
Interesting.
And Ottawa was further away at that time. And he had a career, obviously, as a lawyer and as an Ontario public servant that he decided to stick with.
Yeah.
So, I wouldn't like to claim that politics is a family business for any one family. Obviously, it's loomed large in your life and in the lives of others who've had political leaders of our country. But it does, in a sense, it takes a village to raise a child. It certainly takes a broader group of people to create the interest and then the sense of common purpose that you need to be involved in politics. It's not an individual sport, it's a team sport.
Sure. So, did you know then from a young age, I mean, it's such a standard question, but did you know from a young age, having been surrounded by so many of these people, that politics was an option that you wanted to pursue? Or did you have another idea as a kid of what you wanted to do when you grew up?
I think like many kids, I thought about lots of things, like, I like the fire engines and the astronauts at certain stages, absolutely. And watching those first trips to the moon, I mean, I literally remember the television screen as that was happening. So it was among the options, but it certainly wasn't the only option. And I think I had a strong sense that, the politicians I knew were lawyers or had been in business, and then they pursued a political career. That's, I wanted to do something else first and then see whether the option of being involved in public life and elected office was there. And somewhere early in that mix, I think partly growing up in Toronto and being in a school where from my earliest days, people had come from all over the world, either themselves born in other countries or certainly their parents. I had that international impulse to want to discover the world beyond Canada, but while remaining firmly anchored in our reality here. And so at high school, we ran a model United Nations in Toronto that brought together high school students from across Southern Ontario and beyond. We talked about the war in Afghanistan as it then was in the 80s, the Cold War confrontations that were happening all around the world. I was usually one of the people chairing it or organizing it, but my friends would represent the USSR or the USA or Israel. And so we lived that reality. And as you recall, in the early 80s, there was some urgency to it because we were all worried about the superpowers having some kind of showdown or accident that might bring conflict on a grand scale. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But I became curious about, how the international system worked.
You went to McGill.
Yes.
And then you went to Oxford. Is that right? Okay. And at what stage did you decide on the Foreign Service? Because what interests me, too, is that, again, going back to the idea of being an only child, is that you also know that you're it for your parents. And they'd like to have you around because, you're their only child. And you chose a career which naturally took you away, really, really far away. So
no, there's something in that. Like, I was from Toronto. My parents have lived in Toronto the whole time.
Yeah.
I went to McGill, in some ways to be a bit further away than Queen. Then I went to England. Then I went to Russia. Then I went to Afghanistan. So yes, there is a pattern there.
Of going as far.
But it was somehow logical. I mean, in 1985, when we were all going off to university, Robert Bourassa had been returned to power in Quebec. It seemed like a time for us, Anglo, to go and rediscover Quebec. The separatist threat seemed to be on the way out. We know it would return later. And so a huge number of us from my high school class went to McGill, not to go to McGill, but to go to Quebec. And I think out of a class of 70, 25 of us went or something. So it felt like a migration.
Sure.
And how did I get involved in the Foreign Service? Some friend of mine, to whom I'm eternally grateful, at McGill just said, the exam's happening, in 2 weeks, let's go. And we'll just lose a day on a weekend. But who knows what might happen. And I wrote it and then forgot about it, and it took an incredible amount of time for them to process thousands of people write this exam. And then suddenly I had a phone call saying, can we interview you? And And then a little bit after that, can you come and join us? And by that time, I was at Oxford, only halfway through my second degrry there.
Did you finish up?
I did. And I said, listen, I can't drop this.
Mm-hmm.
I have money, scholarships, and a commitment. I want to finish this. And they said, well, we need you in 2 weeks. I'm not sure if that'll work. But they went off and reconsidered and let me come the next year. And I actually joined the Foreign Service then in 1991.
Wow.
As the Soviet Union was about to implode.
Yeah.
Along with Hélène Laverdière, who is a member opposite for the NDP.
Isn't that something?
And we haven't had foreign service officers in Parliament for quite a while.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that two from the same year would show up.
Did they post you to Russia right away?
No. My first duties that had to do with Russia 2 weeks after joining the Foreign Service were actually watching CNN all night to find out what was happening during the attempted coup.
To report to the minister?
We depend on you, television people, for these things.
You know, it's so funny you say that because I actually remember as a kid, all these people coming into our house to install this thing called CNN. Basically,
Right.
we got satellites so we could have CNN. And it was probably 1990, 91.
Yep.
And it was so that we could have some sense of what was going on overseas.
Yep. And they made their name and their ratings
Yes.
on those events in the Soviet Union and later Russia, right? The attempted coup and then everything that went onward came after that. So,
but if you think about how we get our news now, and you think that, really 20 years ago, that leaders of countries were depending on CNN, sitting at home with their remote controls, watching what the news was to get what was going on in the world. It's quite a remarkable change.
It is remarkable, but that, I think there's a lesson there. That, instantaneous account of what was happening, not overnight through a newspaper or mediated in any way from a reporter and the camera, is now in the hands of thousands of people, right? Because you can record on your phone. We see the images coming out of Syria every day. People are blogging, people are tweeting from all over the world. So that was the beginning of an instant connection, some not quite instantaneous gratification, but certainly instantaneous access to what's happening around the world. That has now become, not just CNN, but dozens of such networks, and then thousands of people behind them who have that power.
Yeah.
It's really incredible how different the world is.
Did
today.
it affect your job as a Foreign Service officer, and then when you were in Afghanistan as ambassador, did it affect your job, that kind of immediate?
It did, because we were always playing catch-up with the media. And so we had to follow what the media was doing. We had to know journalists and work together to a significant extent. But I think this is one of the issues that still exists with diplomacy, not just for Canada but for the whole world. Diplomats used to have that privileged access to what was happening, and then they would convey the story before anyone else. Now the story is long since gone. So you need to be more strategic about what your role is in the story, how you want to influence events. You have to think ahead, and also have a network that includes people who are on the ground, journalists, but other eyewitnesses and so forth, so that you're not just a channel for information, but you're synthesizing views from a lot of different people. Because we all know, no matter how good the journalist, no one story tells the whole story.
Right.
And that challenge of synthesizing large amounts of information and discarding the wrong information, incorrect information, is difficult, but that's what journalists need to do now. And that's what diplomats need to do now. And even in those days, we were struggling. I think, given the scale of information now, look at the Middle East since the Arab Spring last year, it's more challenging than ever. But it's still a very important role, organizing information and representing it to an audience like Canadians through a government, and then orienting our effort in the world in light of what's happening in far-flung places. I think it's a very exciting career still.
I don't mean to skip over Russia, but I do want to get to your time in Afghanistan, because you made a very specific mark during your time there, both in terms of the work that you did and the profile that you generated, both for yourself and for what was going on there. But you were also very young when you got there. I mean, I think you were 34. Is that? Mm-hmm. So you're 34. Right. You're an ambassador in a country that the whole world is watching or somehow involved in. What was it like to go in there? What were your first impressions when you arrived?
My first impression was of a broken city and Kabul and country. I had seen conflict in Grozny and Chechnya in Russia, and on a lesser scale in other parts of the former Soviet Union, but never a city as damaged as Kabul, not because of the Taliban period only, but because of decades of war, and especially a civil war in the 90s. So literally parts of Kabul had been leveled and 60% of the city visibly damaged. And that was on top of poverty, the absence of schools, hospitals, clinics, any social services on a scale that really didn't exist anywhere else in the world. There may have been some countries, one or two in Africa, that had similarly low levels of human development at that, as Afghanistan did in 2001. I got there in 2003, but it was shocking. Mm-hmm.
Did you think that there would truly be nothing, that there was nothing that could be done?
I'm never without hope, and I think most people understand that what is broken on this earth and in societies can be rebuilt, but we all understood from day one it was going to take time. And the danger that, I think the danger from the start of in our engagement with the Afghans, as with the expectations created in Libya last year and other countries that now have new regimes, Egypt, is that there's a euphoria when the repression ends and the dictator is gone and the Taliban have left, and suddenly you are breathing deeply this very raw form of freedom. You can do what you want. The secret police are no longer there. And I even felt that in Russia when I first arrived there in the 90s. And that euphoria is a tool. It motivates people. But the expectations that had been created in villages in Afghanistan, across the length and breadth of the country, among leaders, were unrealistic. People thought disarmament would happen overnight, a new army and police would spring fully formed into being, that streets would be paved with gold, and they would have a land of milk and honey within months.
Right.
And when you're at $150 per person per year national income, that's what your economy supports, that's not going to happen overnight. And even without the Taliban, international investors were not rushing to put money into Afghanistan. There's zero infrastructure that functioned there.
So how did you go about it? I mean, how did you keep your own spirits up while also trying to temper the expectations of the people that you were there working with and rebuild?
Well, excellent question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. And thinking about it now, I think we did three things. We had to try to work with the Afghans who were actually capable of leading and managing a process of reconstruction. And there are lots of stories about corruption and Karzai's team being incapable. That's not true. The people, the ministers and other officials that we worked with were inspiring. It wasn't the whole government, but it was always a core group that delivered amazing results. And I think the World Bank and other donors across the board have recognized that. but we had to work with them and try and keep the incompetent people, or the people who had hidden agendas, to one side. Secondly, we had to focus on the basics. People would come with all kinds of projects to build this or that shiny building in Kabul. That wasn't what was needed. What was needed was basic rural development, clean water, schools, clinics for 25 million people, most of whom don't live in Kabul. And then the roads, not paved roads, basic rural roads to get there, and basic services to hold all of that together. A few honest officials in every Afghan district go a long way.
You met your wife, Hedvig, in Afghanistan. What was she doing there?
She had arrived as a Danish Army Captain, reservist, before I got there. So I didn't meet her when she was in uniform. And she had been one of the liaison officers.
She didn't take you under her wing.
She didn't. She didn't.
Okay.
She charmed me, but not in that kind of G.I. Jane way. She had been a liaison officer for one of the early ISAF rotations, I think ISAF 2, when it was a very small mission. And she would basically drive around Kabul in a jeep with a sergeant, meeting Afghan leaders, asking how international forces could help. So great job. She loved it and decided to stay on, but instead of going back to her country and joining the foreign ministry, which would have been one plan, she stayed and worked with the United Nations. So she ran some of the UNDP programs on disarmament, on business development. Then she got into the election team and worked very centrally on the parliamentary elections in 2005. And then she ran 2 NGOs. One, the Peace Dividend Trust, still based here in Ottawa, started by Scott Gilmore. She set up the first office of Peace Dividend Trust in the field. And their job was to try and get donors to procure goods and services locally, because that stimulates the economy. It's more efficient. Fantastic success, now a global success. And then she ran the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, which had been started by Rory Stewart, Brit, tutor of Princes William and Harry, who's done many things.
You both seem very evidently to have loved the country itself. So why did you decide to leave it?
We had gotten married. We were having a child. You can't, either one of us would have had to leave and stay with the child, or we both had to leave. And obviously both leaving made the most sense. Right. I'd been there 6 years. She'd been there 7 years. It was time to switch gears. And I'll be very honest with you, Catherine. I was frustrated, not by Canada's effort, because I thought we overfulfilled the plan at almost every stage. But up until 2008, by the international effort, we didn't have enough troops. We didn't have enough resources focused on Afghanistan to actually make a difference. By the time we were leaving in 2009, Obama had been elected. The U.S. was re-engaging. That was the level of commitment that was needed. And it has made a difference. Things are not finished in Afghanistan, and there's certainly not peace. But look at Kandahar now. Thanks to the surge of U.S. troops, it's a different place. So I felt good leaving in 2009, even though many dark chapters have unfolded even since that time.
Sure.
Because I felt the mission was in good hands.
Did you know you were going to run when you left?
I had a pretty good idea. I mean, politics is the art of the possible, so you don't know until you've been nominated, and we didn't know when the election would be.
Yeah, no one did.
But the pattern was they were happening pretty regularly.
So tell me then about you did run, and I mean you fought a hard race, and you won that race. But at that point, you were reacclimatizing to this society again from one that was completely different. Mm-hmm. You are now a father, which is a big change as well. A married man, which is also a change. I mean, getting married is a change for anyone. And then you become an MP, and you're dealing with issues that are totally different in terms of the complexity of the concerns that people are expressing to the life and death type of issues that you were facing in Afghanistan. Was that frustrating for you?
In some respects, it was, easier. We live in such a comfortable, privileged place compared to Afghanistan. But you're right, there were challenges. Going from the adrenaline and the urgency of Afghanistan to our more, let's call them, conventional agenda here, still very important, was certainly a change of pace.
Yeah.
And then, yes, there was adaptation, family, children, what will I do with my life?
Right.
Will this work out?
Right.
Will we win, once we knew?
Especially when you had such a promising and interesting career that you were leaving.
So there was a risk, but I have to say, taking the risk was probably easier for me because we were taking risks in Afghanistan.
Right.
Every day it seemed like the kind of thing you do. And in life, nothing ventured, nothing gained. But on dealing with what voters' expectations and constituents' expectations, it's a lot of work and it's hard work. And I don't pretend to be doing it particularly well yet. But I find it not that different from what we were doing in Afghanistan, honestly. Politics is about nation building. Our nation is at a totally different level of development from almost any on earth, certainly any nation with over 30 million people. And so we're focused on the economy and productivity issues and skills development and so forth. Afghans, Russians are at totally different stages, but those issues also matter. Any time I had free in Afghanistan from dealing with these basic human needs, we'd be talking about the economy. We'd be talking about the mining industry. We'd be talking about agriculture, because those are the engines of growth for Afghanistan. And I was just in Toronto at the Prospectors and Developers Association meeting. There's an Afghan booth there, and that is inspiring. And it shows we are all connected. There isn't a Chinese wall between any two countries saying, your issues are different from your issues. We are all part of a global economy. We're all focused on issues of education. We're all focused on healthcare. And we need to put some of those issues into perspective in Canada, I think, if we're going to deal with them properly. So I enjoy the constituency work in Ajax because it reminds me of what it's like actually to be an ambassador, to be in the UN, when you have people coming with their particular issues, but those issues are part of a bigger picture, and you have to explain to the people the bigger picture, but also use their particular case to try and move the issue forward.
I really appreciate that you take the time to be here today. I think that everyone will watch your career with interest as it moves forward, as we've watched the first part of your career so far. But thank you for your time today, Chris.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, I'll be watching yours.
Okay, we'll mutually watch each other. Fantastic. Thank you.
From the written word to the word on the street. Join me, Glenn McGinnis, along with Penny Purdy and Heather Suman, as we say happy birthday to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms by talking to those for whom it is designed to protect.
I think that Canada itself has come a long way in terms of the rights of our citizens.
A special commemorative edition of Outburst. See it on CPAC.
The biggest political stories.
This is a shocking event.
The best source for public affairs.
We hope that we can make a change.
Come back to what was going on in the
Putting
country.
headlines in perspective. In depth. Engaging. Always on target.